Watercolor pencils tutorial for beginners. In this video I'm going to show you everything you need to know so you can get started. Welcome back to my channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Michelle. I teach watercolor painting, a little bit of color mixing and mixed media painting and drawing. Also a bit of business and social media training for artists. I make one free video a week on a Thursday on YouTube with extra content on Saturdays for my Patreon subscribers. So in a minute I'm going to give you 10 tips for using watercolor pencils. We're going to go through everything you need to know and I'll be pointing the camera downwards from time to time so that I can show you as well, and I'm going to be drawing and painting a flower for you too. But before we do that, let's just have a little discussion about what watercolor pencils are good for and what they are not good for. So watercolor pencils are great for beginners. If you're looking at a set of paints and thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know where to start, I could get in such a mess with these, then watercolor pencils are a great introduction to watercolor painting. Now long term they will never be as good as watercolor paints, in that if you wanted to do a huge landscape with a great big vibrant sky, you just won't get enough pigment payoff from watercolor pencils. But they're fantastic for small subjects. So if you're just starting out, small subjects like flowers, you know, butterflies, all of these little botanical things, little lightweight sketches, little small thumbnail sketches, they're perfect for all of that. So as a beginner, if you're a bit scared of using full-on watercolor paints, watercolor pencils are great for you. The next thing that watercolor pencils are really great for, and this is the main way that I use them as a professional artist, is as a sort of a supplementary mixed media to use alongside your watercolor paints. So I often add watercolor pencils for detail on my watercolor paints. I'm going to show you how to do this later on. Lastly, watercolor pencils are great for traveling and just for carrying around in your bag if you just want to do some lightweight sketches now and again. They're fantastic for taking on aeroplanes. I'm filming this in a time of coronavirus. We're barely allowed to leave our houses, just once a day. Will we ever get on an aeroplane again? I don't know, but they're much easier to take through security and things like that than watercolor paints, which can sometimes get mixed up with you know, things like solvents and oil paints. The people that are letting you through the customs don't always know the difference. There's a chance sometimes of these paints being confiscated. You're not going to have that trouble, hopefully, with watercolor pencils. And you know, even if you're just taking a little walk down the park, they're great for carrying around. So fabulous for carrying around, for lightweight. If you're going to classes and you don't want to drag, you know, every colour of paint that you take along, you can use watercolor pencils sort of to add in place of taking, you know, 100 colours of paint, 100 tubes of paint. You can add some watercolor pencils in, much more lightweight, much more easy to carry around. So let's start on our 10 tips, and I'll be pointing the camera down when necessary. Now, the first thing you need to know if you're completely new to painting and drawing is that you must use watercolor pencils on proper watercolor paper. I would suggest a fairly smooth paper. They don't apply that well to very, very rough, bumpy watercolor papers. You can use them on any watercolor paper, but you won't get such a smooth effect if you're trying to apply them evenly as you will do for a slightly smoother watercolor paper. So if you've got one of those sketch pads that's got watercolor paper in, that's an excellent place to start. You don't want to be using them on cartridge paper or printer paper or anything like that. Basically the rule is if the paper's going to get wet, you must use watercolor paper, because otherwise it's just going to crinkle up, and if it's thin enough you'll even make holes in it. So let's just have a look at what happens when we put water on two types of paper. Here I've got some watercolor paper, you can see it's quite thick, and here I've got some printer paper, and I'm just going to paint some clean water on. Now even watercolor paper will crinkle a little bit, but nowhere near as much as thin paper. There are ways of stopping watercolor paper from crinkling, but that is obviously for another video. So plenty of water on these. You can see the watercolor paper is bending a little bit because one side is stretching and the other side is not. But look at the state of this one here, and it's so thin that if I continued to work on it I'd actually start making a hole. So you can see that this one is a lot more resilient than this one here. You always want to be working on watercolor paper. Tip number 2, and this is my advice for any medium that you own, and that's to make a colour chart. I'm going to show you how to do it now. So So really important to swatch each of your coloured pencils so that you know what they look like. You can do this for every medium that you own, whether it's watercolour or acrylics or ordinary coloured pencils or watercolour pencils like these. How you lay your colour charts out is up to you. What I've done here is I've drawn two parallel lines. I would obviously make a whole page of charts here, and I've taken lines across. I'm just getting rid of these centre ones. It's quite a good idea to avoid the squares from touching each other, because if you go too near the edge with a bit of water, one is going to run into the other. And then what you're going to do is swatch each of your pencils. As I said, you want to consider how you want to lay these out. I tend to actually group colours together. For instance, it's much more useful for me to have all of my greens in one place so that I can see what they look like. In this case, I'm just going to start sort of dark over one side and sort of with the side of my pencil build up. The idea with swatches is to see what they look like with different levels of water. So I'm going a bit fainter over the other side. And then I'm just going to get my paintbrush and start on the lightest side and just swatch across like this. You want to avoid spreading the pigment all the way to one side. You want to get this idea of what your pencil looks like when it's quite strong and what it looks like down here when it's very weak. So all you do then is take another one and you can go across the same. I tend to cut mine to the size that will fit into one of those folders with the punched pockets, and then I can take it with me if I go to a painting class or something like that. I can take it with me. I can show my students, or if you're going along to your own painting classes where you've got a tutor, you'll be able to see which colours you need straight away rather than guessing. And you really can't tell what a colour looks like when it's in a tube or a pan or a pencil. This is really the best way of seeing what your colours actually look like. Do consider as well leaving a little bit of room in case you need to put other colours in. So you might buy more colours. Maybe you've only got 3 green pencils at the moment, perhaps one day you'll have 10. So do leave yourself enough spaces that you can add. Now, often when you buy a set of pencils, they actually include a blank colour chart in there where you can swatch your own pencils. But if you don't have one of those, I do advise you to make your own little colour charts so you can at least see the colours that you've got and see what they look like. Tip number 3 is to outline your drawing in watercolour pencil, not use graphite pencil. So don't use a standard drawing pencil. You want to start in your watercolour pencils in sort of a light to mid-tone, something fairly neutral that's not going to show later on. Let me show you how it's done. So I'm going to draw a little water lily for you today. I'm going to draw this one here. Now I've got options when it comes to what colour to use to do the sketching in. I want to make sure that it's a colour I'm actually using within the picture. So these are white petals. Now I would consider using, I could use a yellow for these, or a bit of very light brown. I could use a purple or a grey. I wouldn't want to use something like a scarlet red or a brown. Brown can be really difficult to get away with in flowers. It can make them look dead. So, you know, a strong brown, I wouldn't use that. Again, I wouldn't use a green necessarily unless I was painting a flower with a lot of sort of green tinges to the shadows. So I would say for this flower, then my options would be yellow or grey or purple. I can use a yellow if I want to paint a really light, you know, to make a really light sketch. The difficulty is it might not show up, so I'm actually going to use a slightly darker colour, and I'm going to use a dark grey, but I'm going to press very, very lightly in order to make my sketch. Now, watercolour pencils don't always rub out as easily as standard pencils, so you want to keep them really, really light, and it's just a matter of just about being able to see. So I'm going to start off with this bit here. Now, some people say that you should use watercolour pencils for drawing under standard watercolours. I tend not to do that. I actually prefer to use ordinary pencils if I'm doing an ordinary watercolour. because I find you can get a bit of a fluffy edge appearing. I like to use those pencils that I know will rub out later on. There's never really a perfect solution to any art problems. There's always sort of, you know, pluses and minuses to everything that you may choose, but for drawing a painting that's fully in watercolor pencils, your best bet, and this is the same for things like soft pastels, your best bet is actually to start with the medium that you're going to be finishing up with. So I'm just using this grey here. Although it looks like ordinary pencil, it is in fact watercolor pencil, and I'm going to start getting an idea of these petals. I'm keeping it really, really light so that these marks should more or less just disappear once I start the painting. So tip number 4, we're going to go in and create a wet into wet background in what I call a sort of a patchwork shading technique. This, if you're a beginner, can be much easier than working in with standard watercolor paints. So I've got my outline sketch, and what I'm going to do now is work into a wet into wet background. This is a technique that can be a little bit tricky in pure watercolors. I have got a video on this technique in watercolors, so I will put that one, I'll link to that one in the information card above. And I have got, you know, I've got actual lily pads here. I could do these, if I was going to take longer over this, I could do these a bit more sort of hard edged, but as it is, I'm just going to go for this sort of roughly soft background in blues and greens. So I'm making almost a patchwork effect and being careful not to go over the edge of the flower itself. I don't have to worry about going fully up to the edge because I can take it up to the edge completely with water. So I'm just going to alternate now between darks and light greens. So I've got that nice light green here. I've got a slightly darker green here. So here I've got some blue as well. And if you've started off by making your colour chart, you'll be able to select your colours exactly. You can overlap colours. There's actually a hint of sort of slightly sort of purple to the water, so I'm going to overlay a little bit of purple onto my water as well. I'm just going to keep working here. Now I want to carry on this green that's come up to the flower here. I don't want to start with sort of purple this side, it would look very strange, so I'm going to carry on and take that green so that it just looks like there's something vaguely green, a lily pad or just a little flash of green behind, and I'm going to continue that on there. So I'm going to work these colours right the way around my flower before applying the water. So I've shaded all around my flower in different colours of watercolour pencil. All I'm going to do now is wet the background and blend everything together. Now it's really important that you don't over blend. In other words, you don't start with your paintbrush on the paper and just go all the way around, because you're just going to end up with one colour. It's all going to mix together. So I'm using quite a big brush and I'm going to start blending, but every now and again I'm going to lift my brush. So I'm going very carefully along the stem here. Now if I just carry on into this green area here without rinsing my brush, all that's going to happen is, because this purple and blue is so strong, it's just going to go into this green area and mix all that colour together. So I'm going to rinse my brush now so that I've got a clean brush and start over here as I come out. Especially with colours like this, because everything would just become rather a dirty colour if I don't every now and again lift my brush off of the paper. You see that I'm starting one side and working round. I'm not just randomly sort of starting a bit here and a bit over here, because I'll get lots of sort of uncomfortable drying lines going on. So I'm just every now and again just rinsing my brush so that I don't get all of those colours blending together. If the purple and the green blend together, I'll get a really dull colour, which is okay in places, but I don't want it everywhere, do I? I want some nice fresh green and nice fresh blues and purples. You can see as I come along the edge of the flower here, taking my brush along like this. Quite important to use a brush that's big enough as well. If you use a tiny little brush, all that's going to happen is you're going to get a load of tiny little brush marks, and we want this nice soft blended wet into wet effect. I'm going to carry on now. I'm going to keep rinsing my brush between colours and take this painting all the way around to the other side. So at this stage I'm going to let my background dry, because just like ordinary watercolours, if I paint next to a damp area it'll bleed in. So I want these nice crisp edges around the outside, so I'm going to let this background dry before I do the next part. So tip number 5 is to shade evenly and don't press too hard. Let me show you what I mean. So whilst that background is drying, let's look at how you actually apply the pencil. So really important to apply the pencil evenly and softly. So we're going to just rub like this and build up. You can see it does skip across areas a little bit, which is why sometimes a smoother paper can be a bit better. This is just some practice paper. I can press slightly harder here. I've still got the pencil on the edge and fill in some of those gaps. You can also do little circles like this, but you're looking at applying the pencil evenly. And this is a brown I've got here. Now look what happens if I apply really unevenly and start doing all sort of scribbly marks. If I press hard as well, I can end up really, denting the paper, and those marks may not go away. If you dent watercolour paper, the paint sits in it. So we'll look at this one here where we've got everything nice and even. You may still see some texture in the paint. It really depends on the brand. So I've got Derwent, which is a fantastic British brand, but I have heard from people that actually some other brands are a little bit easier to dissolve than Derwent, but I was really careful at applying there, and I've got a nice even paint application and most of the marks have disappeared. Now if we look at this one here, you can see you're not necessarily going to get rid of all of those scribbly marks. Tip number 6 is to blend from light to dark. Now I'm not talking about the standard advice in watercolour of working light to dark, although that's a good idea too. I'm talking about how you actually blend out your faded edges. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to start working on these petals here, and this one up here has got sort of dark on the edge and then it fades down to white. So I'm going to go quite strongly up on this top edge here, and then I'm going to fade out as we come down and get lighter and lighter as I come towards the base. Now it's really important that I apply my water on the light area first and take it up to the dark area. So I'm going to get my clean water, I'm going to start down here, and I'm going to work up into that painted area. And now we're hitting where the very strong pigment is, and I can take the paintbrush out and get that nice sharp edge like this. Just going to go around this top edge here to get it nice and even. I have to have the paper at quite a strange angle for filming, so it's not quite as easy to paint as usual. And then we've got a nice sort of gradually faded effect. Now if I show you just over on the side here what happens if we don't do it that way. So let me draw another petal, and what I'm doing is the same again. I'm starting up here on the dark and fading down, getting lighter as we come down. Now what I did on this petal was start where there was the least colour, in fact no colour at all, and take the paintbrush that way into the colour. Let's look what happens if I go the wrong way. So if I start up here on the dark part, I've got a lot of strong pigment there, and so I'm just going to come down onto the light part. So you can see the difference. That's okay if I want to have a petal that's completely purple, but if I want a faded out effect, it's not going to work. So you need to start on the lighter area and take the water up into the pigment. Sometimes you can kind of approach from both sides, but don't just start where there's really strong watercolour pencil, because all that will happen is you'll push the whole thing across. Tip number 7 is to keep some tissue paper, some kitchen paper, or maybe an old rag to hand so that you can control the water levels on your brush. Really important not to use too much or too little water. Let me show you why. So you can see I've done a lot more sketching now, put a lot more colour on. Although I'm showing you how to do this this coloured sketching bit by bit, it's only so that I can show you the techniques. With a painting that is all watercolour pencil, there's nothing to stop you from going right from the beginning and doing the whole of the sketching in watercolour pencil and then putting the water on afterwards. You will, however, need to let things dry. For instance, this petal here, want to make sure that's dry before I start painting behind it. You know, anywhere like the background needs to be dry before I paint these other areas in. So although you can do all of the sketching to start with, it's a nice idea, do make sure that you let things dry in between. Now I've got this piece of scrap paper here. It's actually toilet paper because we can't get any kitchen paper at the moment because of the coronavirus thing. First of all, there was no toilet paper, now there's no kitchen paper. Anyway, a scrap of old soft tissue paper, or a rag will do fine as well. I sometimes use, you know, if I've got old t-shirts and I'm throwing them out, I sometimes cut those up as well. Now the reason this is important is because you've got to control water levels. Now you don't control water levels by doing this because you'll leave marks. You control water levels by putting your brush on the paper, and the paper will actually suck water out of the brush so you can control it. So where I've done some sketching here now, I can go in. You can see I've used multiple colours on this little bit of petal here. It's almost like a sort of a semi-leaf at the base here. I'm not sure these two bottom ones are actually petals. I think they're more like sort of pale coloured leaves. And I'm going across. If ever any of that pigment starts to spread too far and all become a bit muddy, then you know, just rinse your brush, and if it's got too much water on, you're just going to get rid of it on there before you carry on. So you need enough water on your brush that things spread nicely, but you don't want your brush to be drippy or leave puddles. You also don't want to get what they call a dry brush effect, whereas the brush is so dry it's kind of scraping across the paper. So this is how you control the water levels as you apply the water and as you sort of make that paint, that watercolour pencil soluble and turn it into paint. You keep adjusting and controlling by dabbing on here. At this point, could I ask you just to click the like button, please? YouTube rewards interaction with the audience, so if you click like or leave me a comment or share this video, it really helps my channel to grow. And I've lost 2/3 of my income from real life teaching people, teaching watercolour classes, teaching courses out in the real world. I can't do any of those at the moment because of the coronavirus, so I'd really like to grow my YouTube channel in order to reach more people. Tip number 8 is a technique I use all the time when I'm watercolour painting, and that's to draw into wet paint or onto water in order to get little lines, little soft lines in your painting. In fact, I did a whole video about it. In fact, it's my most popular video ever. I'll link to it above. I should mention that it's one of the earlier videos that I recorded. I had no idea what I was doing with lighting, and I do look rather yellow. I'm really pleased that hardly anybody commented except one of my friends who I know in the real world actually wrote on the comments of the YouTube video, "Why are you yellow, Michelle?" And I said, well, not sure really. Anyway, the content is good even if the lighting isn't good, so do have a look at that video if you'd like to know a lot more about this particular technique, which I'm going to show you now. So I've put more colour on here. I'm still working on it. I've got these sort of leaves at the bottom here, and they've got these lines on, these kind of crimson lines. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to draw into the wet paint with another colour. You can do this on clean water or you can do it on paint. It works equally well with both. We're going to use a little bit of sort of, I've got some yellow and some green there. Don't want to go too dark, otherwise it will sort of fight with the background. And then I've got this nice crimson lake colour here, and what I'm going to do is work in now onto wet paper where I want some lines. They're going to be soft lines because I'm working on a damp surface. But look how beautiful that comes out. It's bleeding a little bit there because the paint is very wet, but you can do it when the paint's a little bit drier than that. I'm going to really get some definition to those edges. This is great wherever you've got petals that have got markings on, or for leaf veins, wherever you've got something like that where you've got a line. There are almost always never hard-edged lines within petals and leaves. There can be some quite crisp lines, but if you look at them closely, they're almost, you know, working on dry paper with paint never seems to work very well. This is a lovely technique for botanical work. I use it all the time, even though I rarely work in pure watercolours like I'm doing today for you. This is a great one that you can combine with your ordinary watercolour painting, or just use it alongside if you're starting to learn to use the watercolour pencils like this to get those little markings and veins, and you get this beautiful soft effect. And what happens as well is that the pencil releases a lot more pigment because it's going onto a damp area. Tip number 9 is a technique that I use quite often when I'm painting botanical flowers. This gives a similar effect to splattering, but it's a little bit more interesting and it's much more controllable. So if you're a beginner, you're going to find it very useful. Also, if you're a botanical artist, you're going to find it's a lot more controllable than splattering. Now this next one is great for things like pollen dust and speckles on certain plants, things like hydrangeas. I used it recently when I was doing a hydrangea demonstration. I've put a few of these little yellow stamens in the middle and I just want some pollen dust above them. It's not technically in the original picture, but I'm trying to show you as many techniques as possible. So let's just make it happen. So again, I'm going to wet that petal and start working in that shadow. I've got some grey down the side there to get a bit of shadow. If you find that the little pencil lines are not sort of dissolving fully, just agitate a little bit with your brush and you can kind of push the pigment in the little dips and smooth it out a little bit. So I've got a petal there that's wet. I'll come down. I don't want to get too much water on those stems. I'm just going to soften them slightly. And now I'm going to get a knife and just scrape. And what will happen is these little bits of pigment will just land in the water. If they land anywhere else that's dry, don't worry, they'll just brush off later on. So I'm going to have a little bit there. I can always, as well, if I want to, re-wet a petal that's already dried in order to do this technique. You tend to get these very natural marks that are kind of, some of them can be quite sort of long or spiral shaped, much more natural than splattering, where you tend to get, you know, it's very obvious that you've splattered and you've got those kind of round marks. That works well for all sorts of things, but I'm rather fond of this technique as well, and I think it really does look very much like the pollen grains that you get on flowers. But this is by no means the only thing that you can use it for. It would be suitable for all sorts of areas where you want some texture. So again, just gonna scrape a few down here. There we are. Tip number 10 is a fantastic tip for when you just need a little bit of paint but you don't want to get your paints out. So in this case, we're going to actually use your watercolor pencils as paint. So this last technique is great if you're out and about and you just need a little bit of paint on your brush. You just want to highlight something in a sketchbook, but you don't want to get all your paints out. What you can do is actually make your own paint. So we're just going to scribble quite hard on a scrap of watercolor paper, and you can actually use more than one colour at a time if you want to mix colours together. So we're going to use this almost as a dry palette. So what we're going to do now is just get some water and we can turn this into paint, and from there we can paint on our picture. So now I've got paint on all of my picture, I've got colour all over, but I'm not entirely happy with it because I think it's lacking tonal contrast. So at this stage, once you've finished applying all the water, you'll find that there are some areas that perhaps aren't as dark as you wanted them to be, and you can go into them again. So you want to wait until your paper is dry. Mine's not entirely dry, but this petal is dry, so I can show you again what we do. And then what you'll do is you'll just go over any areas that you want to be darker. And it doesn't have to be the flower itself. I feel very much that it should be darker behind as well in order to show these light areas up. So you're looking at showing up light and dark areas, which you'll be able to do by adding more pigment. So I'm going back in and working into areas I've already worked into, just to add another layer of colour. So what I've done is I've just gone round, and any areas that seem to be not showing up very well, any light areas that were not showing up very well, I just went in a little bit dark behind. If you work onto an area, again, remember to wait until it's dry before you apply more pencil, and then only go into the whole of the area with water. Don't go in only on half of a petal or something like that, because you'll get a drying line where you worked. So if you go back into any area, whether it's background or a single petal, make sure you put water across that whole area as you work into it again, and that way you'll avoid any sort of uncomfortable drying lines. Do have a look in the description of this video if you'd like more help and support from me. I've got some stuff in there. I've got there's a link through to my Facebook group that you can join. I've also got some free downloadable PDFs, and also details of how you can get extra content from me on Patreon. So I'll also put some links down to some sets of watercolour pencils if you're interested in those. Those are affiliate links, so just be aware that if you click those, the company does pay me a small commission, but you don't pay any extra. It just helps me to be able to make free content on this channel for you. Do let me know in the comments if you already enjoy using watercolour pencils, or if you're going to start using them now. I have other videos that will help you to start in watercolour painting. I've got one that's got 20 tips that are specially for beginners. You can watch that video right now.